This is Just Listen, hosted by George Goodman. Today is August 3rd, 2026. Welcome to the podcast and welcome to a new week. Okay, so today I want to do U.S. federal government policy on the Supreme Court, and I'm going to be real specific here. Why is the real reason why the mainstream media and some elected officials want to increase the number of Supreme Court justices. The last couple of days and probably for the last year or so, the elected officials have been talking about increasing the numbers of the Supreme Court. The number that they keep using is 13 for some reason. Okay, so the Supreme Court does judicial review and congressional checks, etc. Now, to expand it, because we need to get straight to the point here, the Supreme Court requires Congress to pass a new law changing the number of justices, and the president has to sign it. The U.S. Constitution, believe it or not, does not set a fixed number of seats on the court, leaving the power to guess who? The legislative branch. Isn't that something? Now, let's put this in historical context. So, Congress changed the size of the court 6 times between 1789 and 1869, ranging from 6 to 10 justices to match the growth of the country in federal circuits. So we've actually done that before, and you're going to hear it here first. The 9-seat norm. The size of the court stayed at 9 justices since 1869. Now, there was a president named Roosevelt who tried to expand the court to 15 seats in 1937, but Congress rejected the plan. Modern lawmakers have proposed to expand the court to 13, like I mentioned, or more seats to shift the ideological balance of the court. Now, we've set the table. So, in order for Congress to do this, lawmakers must introduce and pass a bill in both the House of Representatives and the Senate to change the size of the court. Presidential signature. Now, here is the balance. The president must sign the bill into law just like regular legislation. All right. Once new seats are created, the president nominates people to fill them, and the Senate must confirm through a majority vote. That's how they would do it. And again, you'll only hear that from me. So the current size of 9 has been in place since 1869. So that is pretty significant. So back in the day, people acted when they wanted change. So the real issue is to talk about people need to be informed of what kind of power their congressional people have. And the Supreme Court can be changed. Should it be changed? Well, you decide. Now, here's something interesting that you probably didn't know. So the Supreme Court can be overruled by the Supreme Court itself. I did not know that. Now, Congress can too via legislation. I think most people know that part. And then a constitutional amendment. So typically in some of my podcasts, I'll point to the people need to get people in Congress busy. But the Supreme Court itself could. Now, there is evidence that if you pack the court, you could actually overturn a previous Supreme Court ruling. All right, so here's how you would do it. New case requirement. A party must bring a real active legal dispute through the court system that squarely presents the old constitutional or statutory question. Then you do something called granting review. At least 4 justices must vote to grant certiorari, which is take the case to review the previous holding. So I'm building the case that if you pack the court, you could get 4 justices to grant the review. Now, 5 or more other justices must agree in a final written opinion that the old precedent is wrong and should be discarded. So that points to why someone would want more people to be justices. That's very interesting. All right, so let's keep it going here. Key factors the court considers. Something called stare decisis, the legal principles that courts should stick to past rulings to keep the law stable. Okay, that's interesting from the perspective of these factors are well thought out. Special justification. The court requires strong reasons such as faulty legal reasoning, unworkable rules in practice, or changed factual assumptions that undermine the old rule. Reliance interest. The justices look at whether people, businesses, or the government have depended heavily on the old rule and how much disruption overturning it would cause. Now, that's what the Supreme Court would consider. So the more people you have on the court, the more different opinions and interpretation of the law that could possibly happen. All right, so let's jump into this next part. All right, the people who want to expand the court, and we know who they are, but this podcast focuses on facts and detail. So currently, the people who want to expand it want to counterbalance the current 6-3 conservative majority, protect progressive legislation, and they say civil rights priorities, and respond to perceived procedural blockades. Have you ever noticed that when the parties disagree, the first or second point is always civil rights? It's always like that, and I don't know why. Because in today's world, we're looking at how the law is interpreted based on what Congress has passed and etc. And to say that someone's civil rights are being violated when the law doesn't support it makes it a little bit concerning at times. Okay, so that's what one side thinks. And again, we know who thinks that, but I'm trying to get away from putting labels on things. Okay, considering the other side. So proponents argue that the current conservative supermajority was achieved through controversial Senate maneuvering. Okay. Protecting policy goals. Supporters believe adding seats and appointing liberal justices is necessary to prevent the court from striking down federal legislation. And they're talking about voting rights, reproductive freedom, climate regulations, and health care. And wow. Restoring legitimacy. Some advocates claim that the High Court has itself become partisan, political actor, meaning that expanding the bench is a valid constitutional tool. Okay, so you decide that. So you're going to start hearing that on the mainstream media. They'll probably pick protecting policy goals because, like I said before, when you're talking about voting rights, reproductive freedom, climate, and healthcare, those the last 20 years have been the biggest arguments between the parties. All right. So the counter argument from the other side is hold on, check, okay, is undermining independence. So that would be the first one. Adding seats for temporary political advantage turns the High Court into a partisan tool, removing the insulation it needs from everyday politics. The second one is the retaliation cycle. Changing the size of the court sets a dangerous rule where every new party in power adds more justices, destroying public trust and the rule of law. Third one, protecting the current majority. The existing non-justice court has a conservative majority. Expanding is viewed by conservatives as a transparent attempt by political opponents to dilute or override the majority. Those are pretty powerful from the other side. And undermining independence, I think, would be one that the mainstream media would talk about. And the retaliation cycle. This one, I think, is very important from the perspective of depending on who the president is. And remember something, currently, the Supreme Court justices serve for life. Now, you would think that the framers of the Constitution would have thought, well, won't the world be changing? And if someone gets in there when they're 45 or 50, although people didn't live, they didn't live as long back then, but that they would have put that rule in place that they can only serve a certain amount of time. Now, so for expanding the courts, you have to decide what side you're on based on the evidence that I have presented here. And it looks like that they could expand the courts constitutionally. So I've laid out all of the facts and details about this, and I predict that for the 2028 election, this is going to be one of the defining issues. Why? Because amending the Constitution, in my opinion, rare opinion, people are not on board with doing the grassroots effort to do that. So it's easier for them to have Congress, specifically the House of Representatives, to make this law and then have the Senate confirm it. That's why in the Senate, they don't want to change it to simple majority, and they want the filibuster for the law to have 60 votes. So that completes the circle of the real reasoning. Facts and details matter in these cases, and you as a voter need to be informed. So this is Just Listen, hosted by George Goodman. Let me know what you think about this critical issue in the United States of America. Have a great day.